Welcome to the second part of the Meat Grinder Retrospective. Next up is the decennial sequel to Super Meat Boy, Super Meat Boy Forever. The history surrounding this game is somewhat complicated, so I want to keep this as brief as possible while still retaining all the important info. The prototype phase of what would become Super Meat Boy Forever dates as far back as 2011, but soon after, another game was entering development that would be important to the history of Team Meat as a whole. In 2013, Team Meat officially announced Mutagenics as their second game, set to release in 2014. However, after over a year of development, programmer Tommy Refenes got cold feet about the project. While designer Edmund McMillan wanted to play around with new IPs, including Mutagenics and another game he planned to make called Camdrum, which started out as an ARG, Tommy was more interested in expanding on Super Meat Boy. The two compromised by pausing development on Mutagenics and beginning work on Super Meat Boy the Game, later known as Super Meat Boy Forever. This was planned to be a small runner game for mobile and PC, a nice but not super substantial side piece to Super Meat Boy. The game was formally announced in 2014, but development paused soon after due to continued creative differences and communication issues. Dissatisfied with working on the project, Edmund eventually left Team Meat and later reacquired the rights to both Mutagenics and Camdrum. A few years passed. The original Super Meat Boy got ported to PlayStation and Wii U, but it was otherwise quiet for Team Meat. But at the tail end of 2016, Tommy decided to pick Forever back up and restart the project from scratch. This time, rather than a side game, it would be the proper sequel to Super Meat Boy, a runner game for PC and consoles with a much bigger scope than its previous iteration. A team of artists and animators was created for all of the game's graphics, brought on to visualize a game with more characters, worlds, and set pieces than the original iteration would have ever had. The game was re-announced in 2017 as Super Meat Boy Forever! And set for release on PC, consoles, and mobile in 2018. However, the game would be continually delayed, even more so than the first game. We'll talk about that later! From 2018, to April 2019, to probably 2019, to definitely 2020, to absolutely 2020, to certainly 2021. Oh wait, it actually came out? Cool. As announced at the Game Awards in 2020, Super Meat Boy Forever would eventually release for Nintendo Switch and PC via Epic Games Launcher on December 23rd, 2020. A little over 10 years after the first game. It later saw release on Xbox One and PlayStation 4 in 2021, Steam in 2022, and iOS and Android in 2023. The game seemed to do at least decently well, as Tommy has called it a success. It also did pretty okay critically, mostly getting scores ranging from 6 to 8 out of 10, but yeah, if you know this game, you know it's very polarized. And honestly, I get it. An autorunner sequel to Super Meat Boy without Edmund's involvement is a really hard sell. And while some people jive with it, there's also a very vocal hatred for this game. Where do I stand? Well, let's get into that. Starting with... So last time on the Meat Grinder Retrospective, I started with the story. But this time around, I want to start with the gameplay because it's Forever's most controversial aspect by far. So for now, I'll just give you the basics for context. A few years after Super Meat Boy and Banjo Girl did the do, whoop-de-doo, Nugget is born. Aww. But then Dr. Fetus beats them up and kidnaps Nugget, and gaming's greatest couple gives chase. Automatically. Yeah, you didn't mishear before, Super Meat Boy Forever is an autorunner. That's a weird take for a sequel. See, I believe the first Super Meat Boy succeeded by subtly providing player options and flexibility through movement in order to provide satisfying gameplay. This change in subgenre certainly jeopardizes those strengths on paper, but there have been some great autorunners too, so it truly depends on execution. So, what did Team Meat do to make Super Meat Boy work as an autorunner? Since Meat Boy always runs, control instead shifts to 2 buttons, and only 2 buttons. The first button lets you jump on the ground and perform an air dash-like punch in midair. The second button lets you slide attack on the ground and dive diagonally in midair. Much like in the first game, there are only a few actions, but they're chained together and used in multiple ways to influence movement to a greater variety than the sum of its parts. Plus, the punch, dive, and slide all count as attacks, which let light combat elements be incorporated into the levels too. When you repeatedly jump off walls and fly through enemies and other obstacles by chaining these moves together, it can be satisfying, and for lack of a better word, punchy. I'll admit that the slide is a little weird, due to how little of a difference of height there is between running and sliding, but scenarios where that matters aren't super common in Forever, so it's not a big deal. Beyond that, you can wall jump still, though the wall slide is pretty pathetic now, and you won't be doing the Mega Man X thing without the help of fans. Regardless of these changes, the controls still feel pretty responsive and are fun to take advantage of. They're good! The level design is less good. Instead of having a bunch of tiny levels like the original, there are only 6 levels per chapter, but they're much longer. Each level introduces and focuses on a specific mechanic or obstacle and consists of multiple chunks, which are mini-levels that are the size of a level from the first game. These chunks are then put together to form a longer level, with checkpoints in between. This makes for a level system that can be mixed and matched for a very, very long time. We'll talk about that later! Chunks primarily consist of jumping and punching over obstacles and through enemies. Overall, the level design and mechanics tend to lean a lot more puzzly than the first. For the most part, I don't mind that, but there's some pretty convoluted chunks that need you to stop and think. In a game where you can't stop and think, the 2-button gimmick also dampens a few of these more complicated mechanics. Take the black holes, for example. You dive to aim in one direction, then punch to fire. It can be pretty counterintuitive, especially when you have to mash. Ironically enough, I think the game did a really good job bringing back and reimagining certain mechanics from the first game. Fans are used in more interesting ways and are easier to utilize because of how the game's movement works. Conveyor belts now come in 3 speeds, and you can get a mid-air thrust by headbutting one on the ceiling. Then you have stuff like the keys and Beatus, which are reworked to either be more dynamic or incorporate the new combat elements. These returning mechanics all appear within the first 3 chapters, but starting with Chapter 4, The Lab, it's all new stuff, like bomb blocks, reverse gravity fields, and these movement power-ups. Chapter 5, The Other Side, also has some crazy stuff befitting its unique take on the end of the world, like the aforementioned black holes, slowing and freezing time, and these freaky space spiders that make the screen wrap around. Some of these hazards can be pretty annoying, however. Chasey saws are fine when they're actually chasing you, and it's cool when they're used for puzzles with these wood blocks. But there's plenty of chunks where they just come flying at you, and you're expected to immediately know how they're going to move based on the surrounding area. These fields of needles and glass that slowly kill you are also annoying. It always feels like you have just barely enough time to escape. Also, any level with spinning saw blades is insufferably hard. But isn't Super Meat Boy supposed to be hard, you may ask? Yeah, of course, but incrementally so. Remember how the first 5 levels in the first game didn't have any real obstacles and gave the player plenty of time to learn the controls? Well, here's the first chunk in every new game of Forever. This first chunk right here is emblematic of a lot of the game's design, where you're just thrown into it and immediately expected to know what to do. That some deaths just straight up won't be your fault. Thankfully, if a game mechanic is too difficult for you, you can just skip it. Yes, entire game mechanics. Sure, the first Super Meat Boy let you skip 3 out of 20 levels per chapter, but each chapter was also very cleverly designed to force you to interact with almost every one of its gimmicks at least once. No matter what levels you skipped, you had to face certain challenges to progress. In Forever, meanwhile, you're allowed to skip 2 out of 6 levels per chapter, more than double the percent of the first game. And because of how these chapters are structured, you'd be missing out on the introductions to, at most, 2 hazards per chapter. If less experienced players who struggle to get past 4 levels don't interface with a solid chunk of what the game has to offer, then it's kind of a problem, especially if what they skipped appears later when they're expected to know how they work. Okay, I got kinda sidetracked there. Overall, the level design of the main game is a mixed bag. Some clever and rewarding, some annoying and frustrating, but most of it is just okay. But that's just the light world. What about the stuff you don't need to do to beat the game? Like the first game, Forever has its fair share of side content and secrets. Nuggets pacifiers can be collected, much like the bandages from the first game. 30 of them are placed in the levels when you start a new game. We'll talk about that later, and collecting them helps you unlock characters. Most of them have additional criteria though, like getting ranks in levels or completing warp zones in certain ways. Yes, warp zones also return, though only 1 per chapter, and they kinda go for their own thing this time. Each one is its own minigame based directly on another retro game, rather than a general homage to retro graphics. Shoutouts to the Mega Man and Punch-Out ones, 2 of my all-time favorites. I really like these, except for the last one based on F-Zero, which is really annoying. Each warp zone also features a sort of rematch with a boss from the first game. Honestly, this is probably the only game in the series where the Larrys aren't terrible. Anyways, you can beat these warp zones normally, or figure out the secret way to beat them to help unlock new characters. And who are these characters? Well, sadly they aren't guest characters from other games this time, but some of them are still pretty cool. The ones you get from warp zones are variants of Meat Boy and Bandage Girl. I like the pixel art for Lil Meat and Mega Bandage, plus Meat Sona is pretty funny. Later down the line, you'll get more unique characters like Tofu Boy, Brownie, Manic, who we'll talk about when we get to the bosses, and even Dr. Fetus himself. But these ones are locked behind New Game Plus. We'll talk about that later! One thing I find interesting is that these characters are used to help chart out the completion percentage, since their unlock criteria spans all the content of the game. which of course includes the Dark World. Like in the first game, Dark World levels are unlocked by getting A+ ranks on their Light World counterparts. This usually involves punching a lot and finding dev-intended shortcuts. Each chunk has its own harder variant in the Dark World, and while the Light World was mostly decent with some hits and misses, the Dark World straight up sucks. Where each Dark World in the first game was a slight step up from the stuff before it, it feels as though nearly every Dark World level in Forever is significantly harder than every Light World level. The difficulty curve is pretty messed up too, like Chipper Grove Dark is insanely brutal at random intervals, while Tetanusville Dark is about on par with Other Side Light. For the most part, the difficulty increase in the Dark World boils down to restricting the freedom of movement the best chunks in the game have, and making you do every input perfectly. For example, there's a lot of instances where you need to jump at the end of a platform and land precisely on another platform's end. It's not even necessarily harder, it's just demanding perfection where it doesn't need to, and it gets annoying fast. It's a real my way or the highway situation. And it's at this point where you can really feel the rigidity of the autorunner gameplay that most of the Light World was able to avoid. It's just not a good time. So enjoy doing it deathless! As it turns out, Super Meat Boy Forever introduces a brand new rank, the S rank. These are obtained by beating a level with an A+ time without dying once. I'll give the game this. It has a really cool example of a bug-turned feature where you can get the A+ time on one run, then do another run deathless, and it gives you the S rank regardless of your time. But that's where the positives end, because these are pretty tedious to do in the Light World and thoroughly insufferable in the Dark World. And unlike the first game, where deathless achievements were just for bragging rights, you have to get these ranks to unlock every character and complete the game. Have fun! There's also a bonus chapter, much like the Cotton Alley in the first game. It has a few names, but I'm just going to call it Dead Beef, because that's the funny one. This one is an extremely mixed bag. It has some of the best, coolest design levels in the game, but also some of the worst and most convoluted. However, there isn't a Dark World here, which is actually a good thing, because it probably would have been the worst part of the entire game. Oh, and you have to S-rank these levels too. Okay, 2 more things for this section. First off, the Meat Grinder mode.
Hey, that's the name of the show.
Added 3 years later for some reason, this mode lets you quickly hop into randomly generated levels. We'll talk about that later! You can generate your own random set, or play the daily level with leaderboards. Weirdly enough, I think I play this side mode more than the main game, which is honestly kinda sad. Plus, it's cool to know that there's at least some other people playing this game. Also added 3 years later for some reason is the level editor. It's similar to the one from the first game, but a little more user-friendly. You can upload your custom levels to the Forever Forge. On the Steam version, this is where you play downloaded levels from the workshop. Whereas in all other versions, including consoles, which for some reason got it 2 more years later, it serves as a means for Team Meat to upload curated levels from said workshop. Honestly, my favorite part of the editor is that you can actually load the official levels to see how they were made. This is a really cool feature that I wish more games with level editors did. So yeah, those 2 modes are pretty cool. I just wish they came sooner while the game had a bit more of a player base. I don't have a cool segue to the next part, so here it is. While I don't have an exact figure, the original Super Meat Boy sold a good few million copies, and you can definitely tell by the production values in Forever. If Tommy was able to buy his parents a house after the first game, then he was going to hire some great talent for the sequel. The visuals in this game are nothing short of amazing. Straying from the original game's style for sure, but I really like what it's going for. The colors pop a lot here, and pretty much everything in-game and in cutscenes are fully hand-drawn animated. You can practically see the effort in every frame. I often hear that the art style and character designs were done in a way specifically to make the game more marketable, and while I don't necessarily disagree with this sentiment, I still like how it looks. I actually own the art book that came with the Limited Run Games Collector's Edition, and it gave me even more of an appreciation for what went into the visuals of this game. Plus, regardless of how you feel about the art, it's really awesome that a lot of this talent came from the internet. People like Paul Tervoord, Temi Chang, Sandra De Rivas, and more. It's as if they took that in association with Newgrounds from the first game and really paid it back. My one issue with the visuals, though, has to be the level themes. They all look great, but when Chipper Grove is just another forest and the clinic is just another hospital, things feel pretty samey for a solid chunk of the game. Once you get past the clinic, though, it's all new stuff. Tetanusville, the lab, and the other side all look fantastic and have such unique color palettes compared to anything in the first game, especially in the Dark World. But for the first third of the entire game to look roughly the same as the first, it just felt derivative. It also doesn't help that Dead Beef mainly reuses assets from the previous chapters. Samey or not, it still looks nice. I just wish we got more new ideas for environments, since the ones we did get are really wonderful. You know what else is really wonderful? Ridiculon! They did a great job with the first game's 5th anniversary soundtrack. So much so that they became the composers for Super Meat Boy Forever, with a few extra tracks by Scatland and Adam Gubman. Let's see what they did with a brand new game. It's okay. Look, I don't want to be mean. I love Ridiculon, but if I'm being honest, this is one of their weaker soundtracks. Nothing is necessarily bad here, there just aren't very many standouts. Most are decent, and some that could have been really good end up being kinda repetitive. Plus, a lot of the game's best songs come from the Dark World, which makes me sad because those levels suck. My favorites include B Flat, Utter Catastrophe, Wagyu Finger, Tautness, and my personal favorite in this game, Jerky. Overall, this soundtrack is pretty good, but a far cry from either of the first game's OSTs. Oddly enough, there's this one track from pre-release footage that shows up nowhere in the final game, and it's amazing? Take a listen. This would have been the best song in the game if it was in. Why couldn't we get more stuff like this? Anyways, one thing that's definitely up to par with the first is the sound design, with the effects being done this time by Power Up Audio. Meat Boy's sounds are maybe a little subdued, but other than that, the sound effects all have a strong punch and presence to them. Here's the sequel to that montage from the first review. Overall, this game has some nice sights and sounds, and that's definitely the case when presenting this game's story. So like I said before, Meat Boy and Bandage Girl have started a family with their new child, Nugget. She's kind of a hot-button topic with this game. This edgy platformer sequel is introducing a baby? Yeah, it's probably not the direction I would have gone with, but I do think Nugget's character kinda works, for reasons I'll explain in a bit. The conceit of Forever's story to me feels like, what if we mostly did the story of the first game, but we made everything bigger and crazier and threw in a few side plots because I like Metal Gear Solid? Low-key, it teeters on fanfiction, but it makes for an entertaining watch. Thing is, the first game only really had bosses so that there could be cutscenes, so it's really cool to see the sequel go all the way with 35 minutes of fully animated cinematics that almost feel designed to be a standalone movie, with action, revenge, suspense, trauma, and time travel. This feels like the perfect time to say that I really love these older Meat Boy and Bandage Girl designs. I also like how Meat Boy becomes Meat Ninja when he gets older, even if it's kind of a retcon. Regardless, I do have my issues with the story. For one, I'm a pretty big stickler for when a game's narrative doesn't apply to the mechanics or flavor of the gameplay. So while stuff like the woodland creatures trying to get revenge on Dr. Fetus and building an army led by an MGS squirrel is a fun idea on paper, I don't connect with it very much because it barely affects the actual game. And it seems like the fans agree. Weirdly enough, this game tries to do a good amount of character work, which is something the first game didn't really bother with. I like the little moments, such as when Meat Boy and Bandage Girl have different reactions to Nugget's many mishaps, as do I like Dr. Fetus being a terrible role model and causing Nugget to give everyone the finger because she doesn't understand what it means. Speaking of Dr. Fetus, his depiction here is another hot button topic. I will admit that I don't really like how he's more pathetic in this game. failing more than in the first, which makes him less enjoyably hateable. In the first game, he was this near untouchable asshole who was always one step ahead and only became vulnerable and pathetic in the end, resulting in his own captive stomping him to death. But I do recognize that this change was made to complement a surprise softer side. This is where I think Nugget's presence in the story shines. See, Nugget is a baby, and Dr. Fetus is kind of a baby. Since Nugget doesn't know better, she shows Fetus joy and kindness while she's kidnapped, causing him to gradually warm up to her as she appeals to his own immaturity. It's something Meat Boy or Bandage Girl could never do with him. They actually kind of show this in the gameplay. The end of level scenes get less violent against her as you go. And in the end, Nugget's innocence and blind compassion happens to be the one thing that calms Fetus down from his literal godlike rage. So yeah, it definitely works as a story, but as Dr. Fetus' self-proclaimed biggest fan, what do I think of this direction for his character? Yeah, I think it makes sense. You gotta remember, the first game opens with, nobody likes Dr. Fetus, and that's why Dr. Fetus hates you. To be shown compassion for the first time would realistically get to him, as realistic as a fetus in a jar is. And even though his character is a bit more multifaceted than before, it's in a way that doesn't erase his entertaining malice. He nuked a city and used its ruins as a base of operations. His ID scan is of his middle finger. He's getting into cloning just to have more Meat Boys to kill. I guess he also becomes a god, but that's honestly not very interesting to me. I significantly prefer when he's this petty, vicious hater who always gets away, rather than a giant, all-powerful being. Overall, I don't hate Dr. Fetus having a bit of a sympathetic side, so long as he still gets his shit kicked in for all his atrocities, which this game does brilliantly. And after all that, his fetus-level immaturity comes around as he seems to make friends with another juvenile, even if he realizes too late. It's all really cute. But is Super Meat Boy meant to be cute? The first game had its moments, but it wasn't really part of the game's core. I mentioned in my Super Meat Boy review that the previous game was half epic video game hero and half disturbed and melancholic, and that Edmund's lack of involvement with this game may be the reason it feels kinda off. I was sugarcoating it, that's 100% the reason. Did you know Super Meat Boy is an abstract representation of abortion? Well, probably not anymore. Remember how the secret ending of the first game implied that Bandage Girl was pregnant with another Dr. Fetus? Well, whatever idea that was for, this has been retconned. The idea that Meat Boy is codependent and physically needs Bandage Girl to survive is still kind of a part of it, but it really isn't at the forefront anymore. The more subtle, dark themes and elements from the original are mostly absent here, even if it still has its violent and crazy moments. Calling it sanitized might be a step too far, but it's definitely sanded down. Overall, a fine story with pretty great ambitions, just not the best direction given what the first game was going for. Okay, that was a really long compliment sandwich. Does this game do anything unequivocally better than the first? Well... right away, one of the things that this game handles a lot better than the first are the boss fights. They were pretty handily my least favorite part of the original Super Meat Boy. In that game, they mostly just felt like normal levels with a big enemy stapled on. Here, being able to punch stuff makes a huge difference. That's not the only plus, though. The variety in which you fight these bosses is very respectable. With autorunner gameplay, it would have been very easy to just make you run after each boss and hit him at the right time, but here, each boss is fought in a completely different way. Big Slugger is a fun way to utilize wall jumps in a boss fight, and serves as a solid tutorial for mashing to hit stuff repeatedly, which becomes a mechanic used in every boss fight and certain hazards later. Manic, this is the brain guy from before, is probably the simplest boss in the game. You gotta dodge the glass, turn on the fan, then jump over and wail on him. Repeat back and forth. This one's just okay. The lab guard enemy well is a lot of fun, looping around, hitting the pipes, and knocking the falling pillbugs into the shield drones. This one gets harder as you go, with more lasers after getting hit, but you can actually two-cycle this boss to avoid the hardest part. It's challenging, but extremely satisfying to pull off. But far and away, the best boss in this game and the entire Super Meat Boy series so far is Dr. Fetus himself. As foreshadowing to his cloning experiments, he sends a whole army of himself at you, which you have to plow through in a massive endurance test. Once you hit enough clones, the real Fetus reveals himself up above, and there's a few ways to fight him. You could hit him with the uppercut power-up, shoot his energy balls back at him, or you could do the speedrun strat and anticipate when he appears and dive right as he does. Time any of these right and you get to wail on him, punch after punch after punch. It's incredibly satisfying, especially after braving the overwhelming tidal wave of Dr. Fetuses. They turned the replay feature into a boss fight, and it's fucking awesome! Amazing stuff, probably the highlight of the whole game. Unfortunately, the final boss is the only one I don't really like. It plays like a normal level, which means it has a lot of those level design issues where these giant fists just fly at you and you're expected to immediately know how they work. It's got hype moments and aura, but that can only take it so far. Not a fan. There's also a secret boss in the 5th chapter if you collect 50 pacifiers, a rematch of the Brownie race. Though this time, you play as Brownie and race against Meat Ninja. Unfortunately, I don't think this one's very good either, but level design is fine. It's actually based on the original Brownie level, which is a cute touch. But you actually do have to outpace Meat Ninja to win, and he is fast. It makes you rush, turning this fine level into a frustrating one. But at least we know that corny piece of crap is alive and well. One more small thing I like about these bosses is that in the cutscenes before, Nugget often hints at what you need to do to beat it. Nugget hits a button, you hit a button. Nugget turns on the fan, you turn on the fan. Nugget hits the thing with a thing, you hit the thing with a thing. So yeah, the bosses have a much better batting average than in the first game, even if 2 of them are weak. Another thing this game does well, it's actually pretty polished. I lamented before how the original Super Meat Boy wasn't as well knit together as Team Meat wanted, and that everything surrounding the tight and polished controls is kinda messy. For the most part, Forever doesn't have these issues. The game handles super well with barely any crashes or glitches. There is some slight weirdness in these blocks and in some of the menus, and I also heard that the wall slide glitch from the first game is also here, though I've never been able to replicate it myself. But that's basically it. It's pretty sound. Okay, it's time to stop being nice. Remember all the times I said, we'll talk about that later? It is now later. Has this ever happened to you? You're playing Super Meat Boy Forever and having some kind of time, but suddenly you want to start a new game. So you pick an empty slot, skip past this archaic scripture, and when you hop into a level, it looks completely different. Well, you see, each level is actually 100 levels! Each of Super Meat Boy Forever's 66 main levels consist of about 70 to 100 smaller chunks each, which are then mixed and matched to make thousands of permutations of each level. With this in mind, Super Meat Boy Forever has a grand total of about 5,300 chunks, roughly 17 times the amount of levels in the first game. The chunks you get on your save file are determined by this seed. It shows up when you start a new game, and you can modify it or keep it as is. Once you confirm, a world is generated, placing 6 pacifiers in the 5 main chapters, specifically in chunks that have a set pacifier location, as well as 1 warp zone per chapter in a light world chunk with a set warp location. Once you beat the final boss, you can access New Game Plus, which regenerates the world with 30 new pacifiers and harder chunks that can only be found in New Game Plus. You can do this over and over, and you won't find any repeated chunks for a long time, and even when you do, it'll be mixed in with other chunks to make for a different experience. Wow, infinite levels! I could play this game forever! This must be why the game took so long. They must have been polishing these thousands of chunks over multiple years to make sure they were as good as possible. They didn't. In actuality, the procedural generation is the single worst part of Super Meat Boy Forever. Yeah, it's one of the main draws of the game, and it's horrible. Not because it's an afterthought or poorly programmed, but because it's the catalyst for so many of the game's troubles. Think about it. If you have 5,000 levels in your game, then 5,000 levels need to be playtested. This game was developed over the course of 4 years, with only 3 level designers and 2 testers. With that time frame and workload, it would have been near physically impossible to make all those levels just as good as the first games. Procedural generation is just not compatible with this type of platformer. Plus, having to design and playtest all these chunks is probably why the game got pushed back so much. Such a strong sense of over-scoping and quantity over quality. It almost feels like it was done just so they could boast about it on store pages in the back of the box. And that's exactly what they did! Ugh. If this game had 300 to 400 preset, really well-made levels like the first game, and released in 2018 like originally planned, the game would have been much better designed and significantly better received by fans. Autorunner be damned. It would still be remembered as a controversial direction, but still overall solid due to its scope and polished level design. And despite the actual game's overblown scope, the game still often feels smaller in a psychological sense. Sure, a single world generation has roughly the same content as the first game, but it just doesn't feel that way due to its structure. It's also worth mentioning that because of the inconsistent level design, different playthroughs will vary wildly in quality. One player could get all the inoffensive chunks, while the other keeps getting shoveled absolute crap. And neither of them will know what they're getting into unless they studied the specific seed they're using, of which there are billions. The procedural generation also doesn't help when it comes to memorability. Players will distinctly remember the specific, definitive levels in the original Super Meat Boy that gave them a challenge, or introduced a hazard that took them a while to master dodging. In comparison, look up any guide for Forever. You'll see at least a few comments asking why their levels appear different from the video. A Super Meat Boy game should not be doing this. Sure, these people probably should know that this game is world generation, given it mentions it here, but it's about the precedent. Everything Super Meat Boy did to be simplistic and understandable was extremely refreshing for 2010, and Forever just doesn't keep that ball rolling. Jesus Christ, that was a nightmare to get through. With how hostile the discussion around this game can be at times, I felt like I was walking on eggshells with every word. So, Super Meat Boy Forever is definitely a very flawed game. I've made that clear throughout this video. And that's not to mention the standards this game was under. Super Meat Boy was one of the biggest games of 2010. It's often considered the genesis of difficult indie platformers, and one of the most important Xbox Live Arcade titles. And on a more personal note, it's my second favorite game of all time. It essentially defined my taste in game design and inspired me to create this channel. Forever did not do that. Overall, it's decent in a bubble, but it absolutely does not stand up to the legacy of the first game, even if it does try. Even then, I do occasionally find myself coming back to this one. Maybe not always for the right reasons, but generally, I can take pride in picking up this game and enjoying it for a bit every so often. Maybe the Meat Grinder mode was kind of the Hail Mary this game needed, though the base game also has enough for me to revisit it here and there. I give Super Meat Boy Forever a 7 out of 11. I know that score might be a little shocking after all the negativity in this video, but what can I say, I like the game. But no matter what you think of it, we can all agree on this. Thank God! Mutagenics finally came out after that initial cancellation. I was holding my breath for too long there. And with that, I'm done for today. Join me next time on this retrospective for a review on Dr. Fetus's Mean Meat Machine, a game that will definitely not be getting a 30-minute review. Stay tuned. That's it for today. If you liked what you saw, subscribe. I'll be making Super Meat Boy videos every so often.